Welcome to all of you in the studio and those online. Today, we have with us Lindsay Walsh, who is a graduate in natural sciences from Trinity College Dublin, where she's studying for a master's in development practice, and Tariq Guptu, who just finished his master's of philosophy in economics from Oxford University. Lindsay and Tariq, thank you for joining us, and more importantly, congratulations on winning the essay competition.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Great. So Lindsay, let me just jump in and let me start with you. Carla mentioned the fact that climate change is a very important topic for us, and consistent with one of the main points in your essay is that we also do find in our research that climate change affects the lowest income people most severely. Now, when people think about the impact of climate change, it's not that they automatically think about inequality. And that's what's really clever about your essay, is you make that connection. So can you tell us something about what made you make that connection, and how do you see that connection?
Well, I think it's interesting because the way the media has presented climate change to us, I mean, at first it was very much a conservation issue and, you know, the image of polar bears on melting sea ice. And then it became an environmental issue, and governments kind of started to take notice of it, but it was like something for environmentalists to deal with, you know, over there, as if the environment doesn't encapsulate everything and we live within it, obviously. And now I think people are beginning to realize that climate change is going to impact every single aspect of our lives. I mean, sea level rise, drought, famine, climate migrants, conflict, disease, like the list goes on. And all of these things I just mentioned, they're going to impact low-income countries by far the most. Yet they contributed least to this problem. I mean, the US and the EU contributed around 50% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, yet and like the entire continent of Africa has contributed less than 4%. Like, the difference is there. Yet the continent of Africa is already witnessing the impacts of climate change. Mm-hmm. And inherently, it's a problem of the wealthy over-consuming. So, I mean, 10% of the top 10% wealthiest people in the world have contributed 50% of emissions. I mean, that number is staggering, I think. And it's the same, it's between countries and it's also within countries. I mean, even here in the US, Black and Hispanic communities are far more likely to experience air pollution than white communities. So across the board, it's going to affect those least well off and those least able to defend and least able to adapt afterwards and rebuild. And I mean, everyone's going to be impacted, but it's going to be the poorest who are going to be the first hit and the worst hit. And we're basically, in the future, going to see this problem of climate apartheid, where if you can pay to save yourself, you will be able to save yourself. And I think that is just the biggest issue of inequality and of crisis that we're currently facing.
No, I mean, that's a great point that you make, and it's not going away anytime soon. And unfortunately, there are not very many easy fixes, but it is a medium, long-run problem that we just have to deal with. Tariq, let me come to you. You look at this problem of inequality through a completely different lens, which is a focus on urbanization. So can you tell us about how, you know, the design of cities can help or hinder convergence and lower inequality?
Sure, yeah. So I guess to explain a bit how I drew the connection at first, we live in a world of accelerating and increasing urbanization. We have around 55% of the global population living in cities today, and that's expected to increase to 68%. So that's 2 out of 3 people. Not only that, but we're seeing that this is most prevalent and the rates are the highest among the emerging economies. So this isn't just a matter of this is a rich country's problem, this is a poor country's problem, this is every country's problem. So I kind of wanted to turn my lens a little bit more towards within country inequality, and if everyone is moving into cities, what's currently going on in cities? And what I found was that what a lot of research shows is that the highest level of inequality is occurring in cities. So cities have become a locus for the most severe inequality that we see today, partially because cities are drawing people from the highest and lowest, or disproportionately from the highest and lowest sections of the income distribution, but it's disproportionately awarding people who are wealthier. So what I wanted to do was look at the mechanisms as to why this is occurring in cities. So if a ton of people are moving into cities, and cities are very unequal, what's going on? And I wanted to highlight the role of transportation and all of that. So if you think about it, transportation is not something that we really think about too much, but it's something that we do all the time. Transportation leads us to our jobs. If we take transportation infrastructure, whether it's roads, trains, bridges, ferries, what have you, to our jobs, our kids' schools, groceries for food, very important services in a city. And people are moving into a city in order to have access to a market. However, the access to a market within the city is unequal based on the accessibility of affordable public transport. If you look at it this way, good transportation allows you better access and quicker access to your jobs, to your schools, to important services. However, a lack of connections or a misallocation of connections based on taking you places to where you're not planning on going anyway, that's going to inhibit your upward mobility. It limits the scope within the city in which you can apply for jobs or search for jobs, reaching services, creating food deserts, for example. It's hard for you to reach groceries. And it just hinders your overall productivity, not having access to the entire market that the city has to offer. So if we want to be able to welcome people into cities and really bring out the most productivity and upward mobility out of people who are moving in the developing world and the developed world, we need to focus on leveraging data to figure out where people are and demographic patterns of urban expansion, so we can better plan limited transportation budgets to really get the most bang for your buck when you're planning transportation infrastructure.
No, that's great. I mean, one of the issues that we've been emphasizing recently is about the need for some countries to invest more in their infrastructure. And as you point out, this is not just an issue about overall growth, but it's also an issue about inequality, and better public transportation, for instance, can improve that. So let me just move on to a couple of questions that were posed submitted online. So the first question is, it's clearly the case that young people care a lot about this issue of inequality, and so why is that? And then the second question is that what should governments do to tackle this inequality? Lindsay, would you like to go first?
Okay, well, coming from a climate change perspective, I suppose, I think that our generation is realizing that a lot of the factors that are destroying the planet are also, like, such as relentless pursuit of profit and deregulation, are also negatively impacting our lives. So causing inequality, first of all, yes, but also breaking down social cohesion and weakening of institutions as well. And I don't think that we have this romantic idea that the market can fix it all. And secondly, I think that the youth of today are generally quite compassionate. I think we have a different set of values, different set of kind of goals to work towards. A lot of people going into the workforce now don't want to just climb the corporate ladder and make a lot of money. A lot of people I talk to, they want to create some social good as well. And I think we've kind of realized that the bottom line being the be-all and end-all doesn't make people very happy, and it doesn't make societies very happy. And then with climate change particularly, I think that we're pretty sick of being lied to a lot by governments and by private entities as well. I mean, fossil fuel companies and governments have known about the dangerous impacts of greenhouse gas emissions since 1965. And since then, they've covered this up and they've, spread misinformation. And I think that very few people in positions of power have really stepped up to the plate and talked about this and really done something about it. And so I think the youth have had to move and kind of lead to the leadership positions in that.
So what should the government do about tackling inequality? You don't need to, it's a difficult question. You certainly don't need to have the answers to it, but if you have any thoughts.
For government, I think there's a lot private and public sector can do. So carbon taxes, yes, which I know the IMF are very in favor of. And yes, they're very good, but they're just one tool that needs to be used. I think when Nordhaus proposed them, and if they'd been implemented back then, they would have worked very well. But that was a long time ago. I think the boat on gradual change has well and truly sailed at this point. Maybe if we'd implemented them 30 years ago, they would have worked well. But we also need governments to stop issuing licenses for coal, oil, gas exploration. We need fee-based, whereby, you know, the polluter pays principle, whereby polluting industries are taxed highly and rebates are given to green energy. We need subsidies for the scale of renewable energies that we need to implement, and we need a just transition from the government, particularly for the workers who will be moved out of like the coal and oil and gas industry, because I think the climate movement is really a movement that's built on justice because it's so inherently linked. You can't extrapolate one from the other, I don't think. So yeah, we need institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank to really support these. And I don't know if the IMF itself or the World Bank or any existing institution has the structure in place to really handle the scale of this crisis. I think governments need to come together. We need multilateralism, and we need an international climate fund that's purely dedicated to tackling the scale of this crisis. Because the truth is, a lot of people in positions of power today, they're not going to be alive to see the true devastating impacts of climate change. It's going to be far down the line, but I think those people really need to look at themselves and think about what legacy they want to leave personally and what legacy they want to leave for their institutions as well, because there's two paths we can currently take right now. We can continue on business as usual and not upsetting the status quo, and people will pay for it with their lives, or we can go and we can make those tough decisions, as Carla was talking about. We can truly step up to the plate now, and we can finally prioritize long-term well-being over short-term profits.
So even for people who care, maybe are not going to be around, and maybe who don't care about their legacy, but if they care about being re-elected, and if there are enough people who care about this issue, it can become a short-term issue for them too.
Absolutely.
So I think that's certainly the case. Tarek.
Yeah, very much so. So I guess to start with why the youth are, or why my generation is into this problem is, I would say that youth unemployment and youth mobility into cities, or youth migration into cities, are both very salient issues in which once this essay came out and I started talking to it about people, especially my peers, they started to talk about how their personal experiences and if you think about it, the youth are the people who have the most capacity for upward mobility. Those are the people who typically have advanced degrees and are coming in looking for work in cities. However, city living costs are going up because the lack of public infrastructure in cities has naturally made places with the best services and with the best assets in it, so jobs and such, with very high rents. So as a result, the youth who are moving into cities can't necessarily afford those places to live in. And if they don't move into an area with affordable, sustainable public transport, they do not have equal access to those markets, inhibiting their upward mobility. So this is kind of where the government would come in. It's the government's job to stop market failures. And market failures are something that occurs when, say, the market is running completely unfettered. And I think that in today's world, and now that a lot of countries have been developing, we've kind of started to reach a general consensus that some government presence is necessary rather than letting development go completely unfettered. Because if you look in the context of urbanization, for example, if urbanization runs uncontrolled and public transport does not match the needs of where people need to go, you're just looking at a collection of suburbs, some communities doing better than others. And that's not something that will sustain a long-term growth strategy for a lot of these countries, perpetuating spatial inequality. So I think what the government can really do is they know they're short on funds, but they also know that most governments are short on funds to do everything they would like to do. But they also have an electoral mandate to make sure that they're maximizing mobility in a city. So I think the main thing that they can do is leverage data on the demographics of urban expansion, so they can really draw a little bit more certainty on where people need to go, where communities need to go, and what kind of services they need to be connected to, so they can more efficiently plan their limited budgets. Also, drawing more certainty using data actually makes the private sector more comfortable with public-private partnerships, because infrastructure as a whole is a very uncertain investment. You're not necessarily sure once you build something, what's the utilization going to be? So the private sector is very worried about their return on investment. However, if intermediaries like the IMF, World Bank, so on, maybe some consultancies and other partners work between the government, help coordinate the efforts between the government and the private sector to really make well thought out, well-funded projects that are targeting the right places that can really make a huge difference in kind of making cities from a vehicle of economic divergence to a vehicle of economic convergence.
No, that's great. I like your specificity in taking into account the practical challenges and the need that there will be public-private partnerships and how that can be made more attractive by having a more scientific, data-driven approach over here. So, I mean, we've already started talking about solutions, but tied to your essays, I want to kind of ask very specific solution questions. So Lindsay, with you mentioned that it is indeed the case that wealthiest countries are the biggest culprits in terms of polluting the environment and responsible for climate change. But unfortunately, the brunt goes on the poorest parts of the world. So we have this problem where, you know, if you live in a rich country, this may be a non-issue to you and you might worry less about it. And so then that gives you even less of an incentive to undertake the right measures from a global perspective. Do you have any solutions to this, or are there particular ways we should be thinking about this?
Well, a lot of people say that fossil fuel companies and high-income countries owe lower-income countries reparations. I think one estimate is that the US owes over $4 trillion in climate debt to developing countries, which is a lot of money. But I think the first thing we can do is obviously lower our emissions. Secondly, there's a lot of speak of the Green New Deal in the United States of America. Perhaps an international Green New Deal would be better, in which lots of different countries, or all countries, come together and create a system whereby all of them are phasing out fossil fuels and implementing renewables for a starter. And so it's not just one country, because it's such a global problem. If one country does something, it's actually not going to make a big difference, and climate change will continue unabated. Like, we need all countries to work together, so we need multilateral mechanisms, essentially. And these need to be pushed by the wealthy, who have the most power and the most clout in the political sphere. Also, as I mentioned, International Climate Fund, which mandate would mainly be, I think, to help vulnerable countries prepare and also to provide relief afterwards. And this would be largely funded by high-income countries, but I think it should be headed by persons from these low-income countries, like where it's going to be needed most, so that they can choose their own path to a green future, essentially. Thirdly, one thing that's been suggested is a green Manhattan project. So because a lot of our projections will include, you know, carbon capture and storage and such to meet our emissions targets. I mean, we're currently on track for 4 degrees warming. And even at 2 degrees, it's a seriously bad situation anyway. So we need the greatest minds from the world to come together, essentially, to create these technologies if they are going to be created. And then we also need a lot from the private sector as well. So we need banks to stop issuing loans to fossil fuel companies, or at least phase it out. I mean, fossil fuel loans from banks have actually been rising since 2015. We need asset management companies such as BlackRock to stop investing in fossil fuel companies and take them out of their passive indexes as well. Because a lot of people don't even know that their retirement funds are going into these projects and such. And then also for perhaps insurance companies to stop offering insurance for these coal mines and et cetera, and offering that peace of mind to investors that really probably shouldn't be there. And then lastly, I think us, even in this room and listening to this, a lot of us have a responsibility living in these countries that have long benefited at the expense of other countries, really, to use our privilege to voice our concerns on this issue. A lot of the indigenous groups and the people from these low-income countries don't get the platform that I have right now, even, you know, to get to talk about these issues. And I think we owe it to them and those countries and the world to talk about this and get it on the agenda.
Oh, thank you. I mean, many of these issues that you raised, we are going into it at this point at the fund too. The Global Financial Stability Report that we put out actually has a chapter on green financing and how that's growing and how more needs to be done on that front. Tariq, to you again, a pointed question related to your essay. Can you give us an example of a well-planned city that's managed to minimize inequality between the rich and the poor, and
Yes.
how did they do it?
Yeah, so in the essay I read about Curitiba, which is a city in Brazil. Brazil is one of the countries that I wrote my thesis on, a couple of cities in the area and how they respond to transportation interventions. But speaking a bit more about Curitiba, they built what's called a BRT system, a bus rapid transit system, which is a radial system of buses creating these urban corridors with dedicated lanes for the buses leading from downtown to the outer parts of the city, connected to a local network at each node. So as a result, people in the local areas can hook up to the radial pattern and move into the city as they want. Now, what this did for Curitiba was it allowed each locality in the city to be able to have access to the main hub where jobs are located. But and this was actually planned in 1970. So mind you, this was a very long time ago. The technology and the ability for good planning is there. They were actually able to address a lot of budgetary shortfalls through partnering with private sector bus operators. So it was planned by the Institute of Research and Urban Planning in Curitiba and the municipality of Curitiba, which paired up with these private companies to operate the buses. So the funding was practically done, and it was done so that the coverage could be well spaced between the entire city. Now, one of the, maybe it was unanticipated, but good consequences of this plan was that urban development actually occurred along these urban corridors, for example. So like along the bus corridors, more restaurants, office buildings, and zoning for commercial areas started to spring up. So it actually, by being more proactive rather than reactive about the urban planning, Curitiba expanded in a way that the urban centers and where the valuable services are actually more accessible just purely distance-wise for the people who are moving into the city. But now even Curitiba is running into problems because the bus rapid transit network has not been able to recently proactively keep up with urban expansion patterns. And as a result, that has led to a lot of people switching back to cars. So I should have pointed out earlier, kind of more to Lindsay's point, but the bus rapid transit system is powered by green energy. Mm-hmm. So it kind of, tying in the two issues together, we could definitely say that it's on the onus of the government and the private sector to work together to make sure that people are hooked up to a sustainable green transportation network, because this will actually improve the health of the city. We don't really think about it in these terms, but development of a city is all good and well, but when the city starts to reek of smog, it's not going to make a very positive living environment for everyone. And if everyone's moving into cities, we want to make sure that our cities are habitable as possible. So it's very important that we really keep in mind that we're subsidizing or having incentives for green transportation networks and kind of maybe either penalizing or making it a little bit more difficult to have the business as usual transportation networks when possible. And I think if we're more proactive about that, like Curitiba was, we'll be in good shape. But the government needs to be constantly vigilant mm-hmm. about the expansion of urban patterns, because if they don't, people will switch back to cars, and then leading to higher commuting times and more congestion and pollution.
Indeed, absolutely. So let me go to the audience now, and I will pick 3 questions, and then we will come back to you.
Hi, my name's Casey. I'm a student at Georgetown University. First, I really want to thank Lindsay. I really want to thank you for what you said about kind of the youth's moral compass. I really hope that we can mobilize the general populace to support a more sustainable future. So thank you for saying that. My question is for Tariq. I study development. I'm very interested in informal economies. And so I was kind of wondering what your thoughts were about how public infrastructure investment can help shift jobs from the informal sectors to more formal sectors, or if that's the right way to frame the question at all.
Sure, yeah, I can definitely help with that. So in the
let's pick up another 2 questions, and then we'll come back.
Sorry.
Yes,
in
I'm
the interest of
Petrovsky,
time.
and I'm here basically as a grandfather. The eldest one is 8 years, so he can't be here yet. Very short questions. If a high carbon tax is placed and revenues are shared out equally to all, would that not tackle simultaneously climate change and inequality? Second question, on education, how much should it be a joint venture? Universities, you say anyone has a salary over a certain level, pays a certain percentage to the university, that would sort of free people from their debt. And the third, perhaps the hardest question is, much of the employees right now pay a payroll tax for every human they employ. And those payroll taxes pay Social Security and Medicare. Now, should we put a payroll tax on robots? Should that tax be high so that you young can compete with robots for the jobs? Or should it be low so that the robots do the most jobs for you? It's questions that will come up because there are going to be big holes in the Social Security systems. Thank you.
Wait, shall we just take two? Okay, so we don't have time for another one. So quickly, again, you don't have, these are hard questions. You don't
Sure.
have to have the
I can
answers
definitely
to it,
give
but-
the informality question a shot. So,
Okay.
not sure if this answer will completely satisfy you, but I can give you an example in the essay that did not work, and maybe that will shed some light on your question, all right? So, I cite the Rio Olympics, the 2016 Rio Olympics, and the planning of their bus rapid transit system. This was a very expensive bus rapid transit system that actually was meant to initially connect people to the city, but the municipality of Rio insisted that this was something that could be used later on as sustainable transportation infrastructure. But the problem with with Rio's BRT as opposed to Curitiba's was that Rio actually connected their bus rapid transit system to a place that it connected people who didn't necessarily want to go to a specific area. So 60% of formal jobs are located in Brazil's or in Rio's downtown area. However, the bus rapid transit system connected people from the northern and western poorer neighborhoods to an area of real estate speculation where a lot of wealthier people lived. This actually only linked people to informal jobs, working as domestic servants for people in the zone of real estate speculation, as opposed to where 60% of the jobs are located. So we just need to be very mindful about where people need to go and where the formal jobs are so we can be more prudent on where we want to connect people so formalization can actually increase. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay. Lindsay, a
And
couple
then
of points.
the question on carbon taxes, was
So
it?
there were a couple, so there's a question of, can we impose carbon taxes and the revenue that we could collect, can we then just return it back to the people? And because, the richer people tend to use more fuel and they're going to end up paying higher taxes, there's a redistributive effect. And therefore, in that sense, it also helps with the inequality problem. And then there was a piece about taxing payroll tax on robots, but
Okay.
you can decide whether you want to talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. Carbon taxes can be used. The fees absolutely need to be used to address inequality. Otherwise, it'll never work as a system, I don't think. If you're ending up just taxing the poor and not giving back the money, I don't think society would be in favor of that either. So yeah, carbon taxes is definitely, they should be reinvested in
Great.
the public.
Great. Thank you so much. Just one last question, which is, what advice would you give to young people and even old people who want to get engaged in these issues?
Who should start?
Yep. Tarek, why don't you go?
I guess the advice that I would give is thinking about a large, complex problem like inequality can kind of discourage people if you think about it as, how do we solve inequality? So I would advise, I guess, my advice would be to start big and think about the small. What are the small policy failures that are yielding the mechanisms that are causing inequality? And if you think about those small mechanisms, you can be more innovative and you can think outside the box as to how can I tackle this huge problem with a policy recommendation that can incrementally work towards a better future. So I would say, yeah, start big and think about the small so we can get more tangible solutions.
Lindsay?
Yeah, I'm similar. Just keep going, keep pushing, talk to people, write to your newspapers, use your vote. Put pressure on businesses. I think there's been a real resurgence in collective action recently. I mean, with the climate marches and Greta Thunberg, like over 7 million youths, people in general, not just young people, marched in favor of those. And, it's not inevitable that we go down this path. I think we really need to keep hope in these kind of movements. human beings are social creatures, and we work best when we work together. Like that's how we got to where we are. And yeah, so I come from an ecology background, and basically one of the fundamentals we learn is that for a species resilience, we need connectivity, we need diversity, and we need cooperation. That's just across the board ecology. Like, I think we really need that, to keep that in mind now, especially in the face of climate change. And then to the IMF particularly, I would like to say that you come to countries when they are living beyond their means. And I'm coming here now to say that, like, people are living beyond their means, like, without a doubt. And we need to act now. I feel like I end every single essay and every single speech with this, but we need to start acting today, not tomorrow. I mean, it's just getting more and more urgent. And every time I say it, I mean it more and more, so.
Are you guys pessimists or optimists in this? Just one word each.
I'd say I'm an optimist.
Optimist, yeah.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So I think with that, we don't have time for more discussion. I think this was really great. The two things I will take away, one is I liked very much, Lindsay, your point about an international climate fund and an international Green New Deal. I think those are very, and at the IMF, we do like these nice, headlines, and so that's always great. But I think there's a deeper concept there which I really like. And Tariq, your idea about green public transportation for reducing inequality within urban areas, I think was very, very salient. So with that, I will stop, and I will hand it back to Elizabeth, who's going to tell us more about how to continue the conversation with Lindsay and Tariq online. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Geeta, and thank you so much for that fantastic conversation. We are going to be continuing this on CNBC International's Instagram feed, so if you have any questions for either Lindsay or Tariq, please do submit them now before the time comes. In just a few minutes, we'll be asking those live on Instagram. Also, just wanted to mention, if you want to know more about the economic implications of climate change, finance and development, the IMF's magazine will be exploring that in their December issue, so be sure to pick that up. Great topic and a lot to discuss that we touched on today, and even more to come. Thank you so much for all of you watching online and for all of you here in the studio today. Looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much.